We're here today with Professor Brenneise, who is a professor of anthropology at the University of California, Santa Cruz. First, I'd like to ask you the question about what you see as the key trends in higher education in the world today.
It's hard to speak to the entire world. I mean, so I could start by speaking briefly about the United States, where there are at least two major trends which work in somewhat opposite directions. One of the great trends is the increasing diversity of our student body. So UC Santa Cruz is now designated a Hispanics serving institution because of the relatively high percentage of kids from Hispanic, Latino, Latina households, which is great and speaks to the democratization of, particularly at the undergraduate level, of pedagogy and access to learning. On the other hand, one of the, and sort of obliquely related to that, is what I see as an increasing differentiation between very wealthy institutions, primarily private, though not all private schools are, but some public institutions and everybody else, in terms of access to resources for teaching, support for research, and the like. There's been what had been in the past a bit of a distance that was being eroded is now, I think, being sort of pushed back, and the richer getting richer. Not through malign intent, but because they have particular kinds of fiscal and reputational capital that they can build on in ways that other schools have a harder time.
Are there any other developments when you would think even beyond the United States that you would say they're sort of global?
I would think a couple of things internationally, and this is actually a really good year to be asking me this because I'm chairing our academic senate, and one of the issues we're talking about is internationalizing our student body further. It's clear that looking across a whole range of different countries, but particularly India and China, but certainly a number of other countries as well, there's intense interest in higher education, and particularly interest, to our great pleasure, in not only technical fields, but combining that with liberal arts education. So some campuses, such as Berkeley, has about, I think, 15% foreign students. We're at about 1%. And think that it would both enrich our experience and provide a better experience for students who are looking for that combination of technical skills and liberal arts background. The one thing that I would say, actually going back to thinking about the US scene, is in distinction to a lot of the national systems that people are talking about and have studied or are working in that have come up here at the UNIKE conference, that we don't have a national system. There's much more heterogeneity in the US. So when I've heard some great papers here about particular policies coming down from the government in Copenhagen or the government in Vienna or whatever, there's no one who can dictate with that kind of determinate force what goes on in terms of our higher ed practices. The language seeps over and people adopt the language around accountability and impact and engagement and the like, but it takes very different forms in different institutions.
When often, at least in the circles of the people I talk with, often you can hear like the US higher education system as a model or is very influential on what's going on in Europe. What do you think, because you said it's very diverse, there is no US higher education system. What is often referred to, which part of the US higher education system when people talk about the influential colonizing?
Well, that's a question that's really interested me ever since I first went to the European Anthro meetings, because people kept talking about the US model, particularly in relationship to the Bologna Accords and to the notion of a 3-year bachelor's, a 2 years master's, and a 3 years excuse me, PhD. What's surprising about that is I think of it as the British model. And it's much more the way that British curricula had been scheduled, and that kind of sequencing, the difference between a master's and then a research PhD where you don't do any classwork, but you're really involved in a research project. That's much more the British idea. British undergraduate degrees are also 3-year degrees. Not in Scotland, but in the US, in England they are. And I don't know if the British did a good public relations job and said, blame it on the Americans if you don't like it. But I think it's not really the American influence. I think certainly, on the other hand, there's long been a tradition of seeing higher education as a democratizing force in the U.S. and as something close to a right for folks to have access to it. And certainly some political positions see it as a right, though never without tuition, or rarely without tuition. And that sort of opening up the gates of folks to higher education and to higher education in a variety of different institutions. There are 3 different systems in California of 2-year community colleges, and then of 4-year California State Universities that also offer master's degrees, but only recently have they been able to offer PhDs, and then the UC system as a primarily research rather than teaching institution, or one where research and teaching work together synergistically, which is the only PhD granting institution. There are pathways for people to move, particularly from community college preparation and then come into the UC system. Some of my favorite students have been community college folks who may be a little older than the traditional undergraduate, but do great work. But so it may be that democratizing, and the British caught up with the democratizing dimension of it a bit later than we did, and with the sort of explosion of polytechnics becoming universities and the like.
What I found very interesting is that you said you see 2 key trends, and one is the democratization of universities, and the other one is this increasing diversification.
Or differentiation in some ways in terms of access to resources.
How does that go together? Because from the Austrian context that I know, actually I would say that the period of democratization was the 70s. And often I think, like, when you think about neoliberal transformations and decreasing, did you say differentiations between institutions? Is that the right word?
Yeah.
It seems to get more selective in a way. Is it the everybody else universities that become more democratic, or are they not connected with these two trends?
That's a really interesting question. I think they're connected, but the largest number, for example, of minority students by far go to community colleges. And it's a part of U.S. higher education that folks don't understand or have not thought that much about or done research in. Certainly, we would have a higher, the Cal State University system has a much higher proportion of minority students than most UC campuses, though now we in Riverside and UC Merced, which is inland, have relatively high proportions of Hispanic and also Asian American students. And that sort of continued because of a commitment to serving all parts of the community, and also to the political reality of lots of Asian American and Hispanic American voters as well. We also see it as part of, opening up opportunity within California to a much larger group. There's always been an emphasis, or not always, but certainly since the 1970s, there's been an emphasis in elite and well-funded institutions in bringing in minority students, but it's had a different kind of flavor to it. They've tended to be students who've come through particular kinds of preparation for it, sometimes selected because of talent relatively early on. I don't know, so I'm not in a position to say anything about the relative class backgrounds of folks, but it's my sense is it's a much smaller chunk of the student body.
Would you also say that the wealthy universities, as opposed to the everybody else universities, that they have sort of different missions, so to say? Like, the wealthy universities are those who reproduce the elite, and the rest is more this democratic approach to educate citizens?
I think, to use a favorite phrase of anthropologists, it's more complicated than that. There's a little bit of that, but there's also one of the striking things about all the other institutions is there are so many good scholars, many of whom have been trained in elite, well-funded institutions, who are teaching in the other institutions. And there are also a lot of very good programs in these institutions where the demographic impact of having increasingly larger student bodies is more marked than it would be, say, at a Harvard or Yale or Princeton. And so I think certainly all those of us who teach, and Santa Cruz is one of those campuses that's close to but not among the wealthy in terms of our resources, but it's certainly highly competitive with the others in terms of the accomplishments of the faculty, the kinds of career paths that our students follow, and the like. It's really a question of the wherewithal for doing that and making it possible. There are things that, I actually happen to live closer to Stanford than I do to Santa Cruz, where I work. And one of the admirable things, both about Stanford and about the University of California system, is that they have a lot of money which they use, so the tuition is high, a lot of money that they dedicate to making up the difference for students who can't afford it. Stanford can do it out of its reserves. We have to do it out of taxing the tuition that's paid by people whose families can afford to pay the tuition. So we have what's called a return to aid, which is a way of, and that gives you, puts different kinds of constraints on what you can do in terms of aid. Within the past 4 years, there's been a considerable rise in tuition in the UCs. And at every step, there's been a lot of work to figure out the point, how high we can push the limits for qualifying for that kind of return to aid and assistance. So it's not that the very poor can't afford it, it's that many of the sort of middle class have a harder time, which is a broader issue in American society. But I know you have other questions.
Yeah, and one is connected to the question of missions of university, and I read that question so I get it right. Because in the UNIKE project, we're interested in the ways in which universities are being enrolled to produce knowledge and workers for the economy. So how is this something that you see happening in the US or the Californian context as well?
It certainly happens in some of the major debates, and there actually was an example just last week of a major, quite public debate about this, is that there's a particular notion of education as sort of on the Bildungsmodel. That it has to do with development, with coming to develop a range of ways of understanding and acting in the world and reflecting on it, as well as a kind of training for analytical skills and research methodology and the like. And that's been the sort of default setting. At the same time, there have been, and it varied historically from era to era, a real emphasis on pre-professional training or professional training. One of the things that's really interesting in the US is that there are not that many professional degrees that are given at the undergraduate level. So engineering is an undergraduate degree. Medicine, you have to do a bachelor's degree first, and then you go on to a medical school. Law, you can't do as an undergraduate. And the like. And that's sort of evidence of this commitment to not pushing people out into the job market because of the notion that there are other kinds of values that are inherent in an undergraduate education, at least. The imbroglio or the conflict about a week and a half ago was when Governor Scott Walker is the governor of Wisconsin, where there's a very good public university system, said that he really wanted to put research within, he wanted to limit the amount of funds and time that faculty spend on research, and he really wanted to focus on vocational or pre-vocational kinds of education as the core mission of the University of Wisconsin, to prepare students for work in the world. That actually he's pulled back on because there was so much political opposition to it. But at the same time, people have legitimate concerns in terms of, so what's my child going to do, or what am I going to do when I get out of the the 4-year program, or sometimes it takes a little bit longer than 4 years to get through.
And I could imagine that this has even strengthened this concern because you said the tuition fees rise.
The tuition
fees rise. So it could also be like, the more expensive the education gets, the more you maybe think about how it pays off.
Ways of shortening it. or at least of having it, and also of how it pays off. Now, there's an awful term that's been borrowed into higher education talk in the U.S. from civil engineering, which is the notion of throughput.
Mm-hmm.
You know, how rapidly you move bodies through the system. And there's a very real concern, because it's not only a matter of tuition from the point of view of the student and his or her parents, but it's also a matter of tuition doesn't pay all the expenses of educating students, as high as it is, and the state contributes less money proportionally than it had in the past. And the state has an interest also in maximizing the keeping on time of students as well, but also of potentially of trying to get them trained so that they can go into some particular kind of occupation. One of the complications is, in some ways, particularly now, is the variability within the job market, because jobs you might be trained for might not actually be jobs that are still around. Where you see this in some ways, and most interesting, is Obama's move towards his desire to fund everybody in community college for the first 2 years. And some of those are folks who are going to go on to university. Some of them are in 2-year vocational, basically very good vocational training programs. So these are ongoing tensions in the U.S.
That actually, the throughput question or topic, I guess that might even be one of the key trends in higher education, because I know it from the European context. And I was just thinking, that could be something that sounds familiar beyond the U.S. context.
I think that makes very good sense.
Is it just a quick question of clarifying my understanding? The wealthy universities, do they get wealthy through private funding mainly, or is it also because in Germany, for example, you have these excellence initiatives, where still the state there would be more wealthy universities and less wealthy universities, but the state would create the wealth. Is it in the States rather private funding that makes the difference?
We don't have anything quite like the universities of excellence model. There's certainly a certain amount of government support comes into wealthier institutions that have large research establishments, because research grants produce overhead, but it's a kind of oblique. It's not to the university as a whole. It comes with what individual researchers or research teams might be doing. A lot of the wealth has to do with private donor base, with philanthropic groups, with donor bases, with having 350 years of alumni, even if they're not all still alive. 350 years of alumni rather than 20 years of alumni. A lot of it has to do with the relationship between the kinds of jobs to which students who graduate from some institutions move more directly and more commonly than those who graduate from other institutions. And that those are jobs in which they're going to make more money and be in a better position to be supporters. There's also a notion that people talk about in fundraising of waiting for a mature alumni body. And Santa Cruz is now in its 50th year. We finally figured, yes, we have mature potential donors out there. But it is mostly private, and there are a lot of private foundations. I mean, I don't know what the contrast would be with the German or the Austrian or any of the other national situations in Europe, but certainly there's a very high proportion of philanthropic foundation support for institutions or for initiatives that are based at institutions.
I find it very interesting because, at least for Austria, as I see it, there's no such tradition as of private wealthy people donating money to universities or research. So there seems to be quite an essential difference in, and you also mentioned that it takes time to build this body of
potential donors.
Yeah. Let's move to our fourth question to put a positive note to this interview, and that would be
I've got to go back and say what's really positive is the excitement of having a much more diverse student body and having so many more students who are first generation in terms of going to university. That's a really transformative phenomenon. It's something that's really changed during my time. The first half of my career I taught in a private liberal arts college, the second half in a public university, and this is really exciting.
Where does this come from, this change of having a more diverse student body?
I think it comes from partly an active commitment, and in terms of thinking through issues of aid and the like on the part of institutions. I think it comes from a recognition that even if there isn't a direct match between having a bachelor's degree and getting a specific kind of job, there clearly is a very strong correlation between having a bachelor's degree and getting a job ultimately at a salary considerably more than what a high school graduate could get. I mean, there's that level of knowledge about the university as a striking opportunity to move into a better life. And it clearly has long been an aspect of the visions that Americans of all sorts have had about what they want for themselves and for their children, and that's partly for their children to have a better set of opportunities. And I think there's less reluctance than there might have been 20, 30 years ago for parents to send their kids to university.
And when you mentioned diverse student body, you refer mainly to the social background and the ethnic background? Because you said there's, as far as I remember, there's so far only 1% of international students at your university?
That's a very small proportion, yeah.
So
I mean, we're hoping to increase that as well. But particularly here, it has to do mostly with class and ethnicity.
All right, I have to come to the last question. Unfortunately, time is running.
Okay.
And I'd really like to ask you, as an anthropologist who has been working for many years now on assessment practices and changing assessment practices, what do you think that the consequences are of these changing assessment practices for academic careers, especially for young aspiring anthropologists? How do you think these changing assessment practices influence their formation? And as a second question, is there any advice you would give to?
Sure, I will add a third question to that, which I'll answer first. And the third question is, the assessment is consequential, but it's also always in the context of what's being funded and what the nature of funding structures and funding institutions might be. And one of the things, and you had mentioned this in an earlier conversation when you were surprised that I'd worked for 15 years in the same place, on and off, not the entire time. And that's an example of where, and it's much more marked in the European model, in the European and Australia and New Zealand sites than it is in the US, is there's a funding structure that encourages new projects being formulated even as you're getting to the third or fourth year of an old project. And that's a different, there's a bit more of that kind of speed up and moving in different directions in the US, but it's less across the board. And so I think one way of thinking about the advice and the assessment practices themselves, as anthropologists, we're really good at listening to people, at paying attention to the world, and at looking for patterns. And the one piece of encouragement is if you pay attention to what you read, you hear, what you see in a form that you're filling out, what you read in a call for a proposal for a grant, and really try to figure out, so what are they after here? Let's go, do the kind of deep reading and deep listening to which we subject the folks we work with in the field. Be a good ethnographer of your own possibilities and of the framework in which you're going to work. I think one specific thing that's very interesting in the States, it may or may not be the case in Europe, is that there's an increasing amount of interest both in people getting funded to do interdisciplinary research and to doing collaborative work even within the same discipline. There'd been a period when that had been less common, and there was a long period in which individual grants were the major source of funding. There is a program with the National Science Foundation called IGERTS, don't ask me what the acronym stands for, which is set up specifically to encourage these cross-disciplinary kinds of projects. And that's really based on a kind of notion that's out there and part of the funding culture that interdisciplinarity is going to be the way to address new kinds of complicated issues. That's harder for a PhD student, perhaps. I mean, I was very fortunate in that I was in a collaborative project when I was in graduate school many decades ago, but that was sort of almost at the tail end of an earlier model of comparative work. But think imaginatively about what are the questions you might want to answer. One of the things, and this is a real upbeat note because it reflects the quality of this, of the UNIKE conference here today is, as I listen to papers, I find it very hard to tell who's an anthropologist, who's a sociologist, who's an education scholar. And that's because there's really a profound and enthusiastic focusing on problem and topic. They're questions that people want to answer, and they answer them in ways that are not necessarily disciplinarily regimented, but in ways that reflect this ongoing engagement with what matters and how do we come to understand it. And keeping those two issues in mind, plus the notion that you have to write for an audience that doesn't necessarily speak the same language as you do. At Santa Cruz, I think we spend a lot of time convincing our students, okay, that's for when you're talking to Santa Cruz faculty and students. Now write for somebody who's not from Santa Cruz. And remember who you're writing for. Think about the audience.
Can I, a bit polemically, rephrase two of those advices?
Feel free.
Because I think of some of my colleagues who do interdisciplinary work, who are PhDs, and who struggle with the issue of belonging, because in a way doing a PhD, at least still in Austria and Copenhagen, you would usually do a PhD in a certain discipline.
Right.
You do it to become an anthropologist, and then there is the danger of you being challenged for, you know, like the question I always fear is like, okay, but what's the anthropological
about what you're doing?
About what you're doing, because you want to be an anthropologist. So do you also see a danger of the advice to not care so much about the disciplinary borders? Or how to negotiate this tension between the problematic and the disciplining of becoming a certain kind of academic?
I think that's a really crucial question, and obviously an experience in your question for you and many of your colleagues. In the US, people who are working in collaborative projects often are in getting their degrees in particular recognizable disciplines. That's not always the case. One of the intellectual powerhouses on our campus was the history of consciousness. PhD program. No other program like it anywhere. They've actually ended up with very good placement rates for their students. But in the case of the kind of collaborative research, to get a degree in anthropology and to bring a particular anthropological perspective that then gets put into engagement with other kinds of perspectives can actually be invaluable. You always have to be ready to answer the question of, why is this anthropology? Why, if you're studying complex institutions in the first world, is it not sociology or organizational studies? And there, I think every anthropologist has his or her own reasons that they can claim for what it is. It's partly, for me, what we pay attention to, what we listen for, the kinds of multiply recursive contextualizations of what's going on, because we say, well, it depends on the context as much as we say, well, it's complicated. But it's not. But that's partly because, though I have done research in the more kind of traditional anthropological turf of actually working in the South Pacific and Fiji, I don't see our discipline as being wed to the exotic. I think we're trying to understand in the ways that we can the whole of human experience. Nothing hubristic about that. And that includes the communities, complicated communities that may not resemble the folks whom our predecessors had studied. The other thing I would say, and this is very evident, one of the other scholars who's here at the meeting is Brenneise who's tracked the post-PhD careers of folks in a number of social science degrees. And most of the social sciences, 5 years out, people are using their PhDs in non-academic contexts. They're in NGOs, sometimes they're in private companies or corporations. They're often doing intellectually very satisfying work, sometimes getting paid better than academics as well. And I think in the case of those whom I've talked with and whom I've been involved in the training of, there remains something deeply anthropological and ethnographic about their approach to what they do. And I think that one of the things about a collaborative research project, it's actually very good training if you're interested in going into this kind of practice. I think the job market is going to get somewhat smaller for PhD anthropologists, and that I think thinking in that long-term view of what are the skills, the chops, the perspectives, the values that really draw me to anthropology? Why is it what I have to do? And then what can I do with it?
Say the job market, you mean the general job market or the academic?
The academic job market.
So that is going to get more narrow because there's more applicants?
I think that we are probably producing more PhDs and are likely to. I know that we're producing more PhDs in X field than are likely to get teaching positions in X field. The broader job market might actually expand.
I'm just thinking we're nearly over with our time. Maybe just to sum this up with a final statement, is there a final piece of advice or message that you would like to give to future anthropologists facing this becoming more narrow academic job market?
I think if you love what you're doing and learning as an anthropologist, if it matters to you so much that you're in graduate school doing it, you owe it to yourself to think both ethnographically and strategically about what you might do. To recognize that the academic world is like a very, I think, a somewhat increasingly constricted one, particularly in countries that are producing lots of PhDs with far fewer positions, such as in Austria. I think that one of the reasons underlying the Bologna Accords was the potential mobility of scholars around Europe, but that doesn't wholly address the issue. But think imaginatively about where you might see yourself going. Ask people about other ways of using anthropology in terms of their post-degree experience. Think about one thing, just in very particular strategic terms, is think about postdoctoral positions that would expose you to particular topical areas that you have an interest in, would like to pursue. For one example, and we should probably close with this, is where there has been a lot of growth has been in medical anthropology. And with students who have ended up in working groups for the long term, which are interdisciplinary, which are focused around socio-medical questions, where they bring and are recognized for bringing a particular kind of sensibility to the understanding of health, illness, and death. And to sort of think in terms of where a postdoc can help you go as well. And write, and have a good time and love what you're doing.
Thank you so much. I know that you have had a long trip here and it's been a long day for you because you've already given a very interesting talk. So I really appreciate your taking the time to have this interview.
Thanks so much. It was a pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you.